Before we begin, a handful of disclaimers. This video is about A Force More Powerful, a strategy game based on a documentary about non-violent resistance movements. It's a very complex and delicate subject that I've tried my best to research thoroughly enough, but I'm hardly what anyone would call an expert, so forgive me if I oversimplify things or come across as naive. Second, and I hate that I have to keep saying this, but no generative AI was used in the making of this video. What you're getting is all me. And finally, my analysis of this game touches on certain groups with certain reputations. So, I am in good health, do not have any thoughts of self-harm, and I'm not prone to falling out of windows of tall buildings. Just want to set the record straight here. So strap in for another patented Alien Bob ride, because we'll be going places, starting with a lovely little swamp called Washington, D.C. We start this story in 1953 with a young American conscientious objector to the Korean War by the name of Gene Sharp. He was in the middle of writing a book about Gandhi and nonviolent protest when he was sentenced to 2 years in prison for draft dodging. He wrote to Albert Einstein, a noted fan of Gandhi's nonviolent methods, and just before his death in 1955, Einstein would honor Sharp with a foreword for his book, Gandhi Wields the Weapon of Moral Power. Over the following decades, Sharp would play a pivotal role in developing the academic field analyzing the history and structure of nonviolent struggle, culminating in his 1973 three-volume magnum opus, The Politics of Nonviolent Action, the second part of which catalogues in detail nearly 200 distinct forms of nonviolent protest and intervention. In 1983, he founded the Albert Einstein Institution, named after his old friend, of course, a non-profit dedicated to continuing studies in the field. The AEI was in large part funded by one of Sharp's former students, Wall Street investor Peter Ackerman. With funding by the Albert Einstein Institution and the United States Institute of Peace, in 1997, Ackerman, along with producer Jack Duvall, collaborated with director Steve York to craft a feature-length documentary highlighting successful examples of nonviolent resistance movements across the 20th century. A Force More Powerful was released in 1999 with narration by Ben Kingsley, and covers Gandhi's actions in India, the 1960 Nashville anti-segregation sit-ins, Mikuseli Jack and the anti-apartheid consumer boycott campaign, general strikes in Nazi-occupied Denmark, the 1980 strike campaign led by Polish trade union Solidarity, and anti-Pinochet movements in Chile. It is a high-budget deep dive featuring interviews with experts and actual members of these movements. The film was later expanded into a PBS series, and Ackerman and Duvall also turned it into a book, which doubles the amount of cases covered, and to its credit also includes a chapter on the First Palestinian Intifada. Not long after this, Peter Ackerman and Gene Sharp had somewhat of an ideological split, it seems. Ackerman withdrew his funding of the Albert Einstein Institution and in 2002, along with Jack Duvall, set up the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict to, quote, develop and encourage the use of civilian-based non-military strategies to establish and defend democracy and human rights worldwide. From what I can tell, while Sharp approached the subject from a purely academic, theoretical, research-based angle, Ackerman wanted to get out there and deploy this knowledge in the field. And one of the ways the ICNC did this is by expanding the A Force More Powerful project beyond the screen and beyond the written word into the world of video games. In collaboration with Steve York's production company York Zimmerman and developer Breakaway Games, A Force More Powerful, the game of non-violent strategy, was released in 2006. You could buy it for $20 on their website or directly request free copies from the ICNC if you happen to be active in a nonviolent movement. And exactly 20 years later, somehow, someway, a physical copy of the game was sitting on the shelf of one of my local thrift stores, and I grabbed it, and I looked at it, and I went, what is this? Now, Breakaway Games wasn't just some rinky-dink nothing studio. Founded in 1998, by the time the ICNC got to them, they had already cut their teeth on helping out on Sid Meier's Antietam, developed the Cleopatra Queen of the Nile expansion for City Builder Pharaoh, one of my personal favorites, released Waterloo, Napoleon's Last Battle, Austerlitz, Napoleon's Greatest Victory, the Paradise Island expansion for the first Tropico, and Emperor Rise of the Middle Kingdom. And people who were central to the development of A Force More Powerful later became pretty notable names in the turn-based strategy game world. The game's director of product development, Ed Beach, would go on to become a designer for Civilization V expansions Gods and Kings and Brave New World, and rise up to lead designer of Civilization VI and creative director of Civilization VII. A force more powerful's lead designer Ananda Gupta would become senior designer on XCOM Enemy Unknown and was the lead designer of its expansion Enemy Within. In addition, Ivan Marovic, ICNC associate and former activist of Otpor, a non-violent Serbian student resistance movement that played a significant role in taking down Slobodan Milosevic, was brought in as an advisor and subject matter expert. And for Breakaway, a force more powerful represented a fusion of its two business units, because while it was making all those city builder and strategy games and expansions, it was also active in developing simulations and serious games targeted at the defense, disaster management, and healthcare sectors. I've talked a little bit about serious games before, most notably in my video on Remission, the game designed as part of a clinical trial to help young people stick to their cancer treatments. I'm not a big fan of the term, mostly because it implies that other games aren't serious. Really, the biggest difference I've come across between mainstream and serious games is their source of funding, and that they tend to be given away rather than sold on store shelves. But would you say that Papers, Please or That Dragon Cancer aren't serious, important games just because they were released as commercial products? I think it's purely a marketing term, and marketing is one of the great evils of the world. Apparently they're also called applied games now, which is a term so boring and bland and generalized that my problem with it swings in the other direction. But anyway, by the most common definitions, serious games are games whose purpose isn't just entertainment, but could be educational, could have an implicit or explicit political message, or could even be considered straight-up propaganda. As we will see, a force more powerful, the game of non-violent strategy, is all three. Let's take a closer look. A force more powerful is a turn-based strategy game. It's a map game. You know, a spreadsheet with a nicer user interface. You select characters and have them take actions against certain targets, and then pass time to see if it worked. It has an entirely unique system and unique mechanics specifically built around a limited but still quite large selection of tactics largely sourced from Gene Sharp's Politics of Nonviolent Action. Think fundraising, fraternizing, picketing, petitioning, occupying a building, harassing an official, and even organizing a mass protest. The game lets you test out your non-violent strategy skills in a variety of scenarios, ranging from the relatively simple to the hopelessly complex. No matter which scenario you choose, you are never the leader of, but instead merely a faceless, nameless strategist for a movement. And your adversary is always a regime, which can be anything from the nakedly corrupt mayor of a small town to a ruthless, despotic dictator of a large nation. The regime and your movement are subdivided into groups, each of which have their own statistics, ideologies, and needs. These groups are further subdivided into characters, which again have their own attributes, skills, support level, amount of fear for the regime, public influence, etc. The primary action you will take in the game is to assign tactics to characters that are part of your alliance with the goal of undermining the support base of the regime. These tactics can help to raise funds or manpower, and persuade individuals of groups to sympathize with your goals or even join your cause. An industry trade association, for instance, may be convinced that the regime will not be good for long-term profits, though another group in your alliance may not appreciate you cozying up with corporate suits. A character that joins your movement as an individual may be able to convince the rest of their group to join, thus significantly strengthening your alliance. So the gameplay flow is choosing a character to enact or organize a tactic, picking the tactic, and then, if applicable, selecting a target for this tactic. This can be another character, a group, the general public, or certain locations like organizing a strike at a specific factory, a rally in a particular neighborhood of a particular city, or blocking a major road. You have advisors who will tell you whether or not this is a good idea, which is usually calculated based on the coordinator's skill and the likelihood of success. I call the game turn-based, but it's not exactly turns. Just that tactics take a certain amount of time to prepare and enact, and you can skip time to whenever there is an update of some kind, either from your people, from the news, or from the adversary. So you spend most of your game setting up all these actions, balancing them with character abilities, how long they take to prepare, available resources, which is money and people, potential effectiveness, and of course, risk. And there will be risk. Being in the resistance always comes with danger, no matter which tactics you choose. It could just be that the tactic doesn't work, which would still be a waste of time and resources. Maybe a demonstration ends in violence because the coordinator lacks the organizational skills, or because it's illegal and the authorities crack down hard. Of course, forcing the regime to act with violence can swing the public in your movement's favor, but at what cost? Maybe one of your characters has a high public profile, basically a good charisma stat, which is great for turning the public your way, but this visibility can also lead to that character being arrested and imprisoned. This means they then will only have two tactics available: writing letters, which is rarely effective, or a hunger strike, which can increase public sympathy, but can possibly result in the character's death. You can also choose to send them out of the country for their safety, but this exile will again limit their ability to help the movement directly. And while you're doing all of this, the regime is also at work. They follow the same rules and resource constraints as you, and can fail as hard as you, but they're not committed to non-violence. Often quite the opposite. They have access to other tactics all the way up to mass executions and ethnic cleansing, just in case you forgot what kind of game this is. So as you can see, it's not a particularly simple game. In fact, this is the kind of game where you really need to read through the whole manual to understand just the basics. And at exactly 116 pages, it's quite the beast. Now, it's not nearly as hefty as, say, the manual of a Flight Simulator 2000, but yet I'd argue that that game is more accessible because I don't need to read through 100 pages of this to fly a little Cessna around a low-poly Chicago. The manual is also available digitally in the form of a PDF, and actually this version is a great deal more useful, because at the very end they've added tables of all the tactics available to both the movement and the regime and their requirements. Until these are memorized, which I assume would take dozens of hours if not more, half your time spent playing the game will consist of looking at these charts. Would have really appreciated it if they were accessible within the game itself. The player's guide is supplemented by the Resistopedia, which takes the form of a classic Windows help program. Again, would have loved for this to just be another thing I could consult from within the game, but as it is, it's a searchable reference of the game's mechanics. It does not go particularly in depth, however, so I found its usefulness lacking. For instance, I needed to understand what actions I could take to lessen a character's fear of the regime so they'll be more likely to join my movement. And it just tells me that fear is a property that can be affected by tactics, which, like, yeah, obviously. I want to talk just a little bit about how the game looks and feels. Graphics for strategy games tend to be secondary, and the same is definitely true here. The country maps are very low detail, meant only to show you basic geographical and logistical relations between points of interest and potential targets for disruption. But the 3D city maps give the places you're supposed to be liberating a little more character. They function mostly as set decoration and a little bit to indicate neighborhood stats in an overlay, but you can zoom in and see cars driving and people walking. It's really the only thing that gets you close to a bit of an on-the-ground perspective. Map games tend to be somewhat detached affairs, very zoomed out, very menu-based, very abstract. But little vignettes like this, as generic as they may be, are very helpful to remind you that this is about people. But the real star of the show is the notebook aesthetic. The entire user interface consists of spiral-bound scribbles and post-it notes and highlights and ballpoint circles. Even the game box and manual are a part of it. Look, the spine of the box is marker on duct tape. It's a constant reminder of the scrappiness of the movement, and as someone with at least 5 different notebooks in active rotation at any one time, I really appreciate how far they took it. One can imagine a bizarro version of this game in which you play as the regime, having a much more organized, bureaucratic, strict-looking interface in comparison. To demonstrate the flow of the game to you, what it's like to play, I'm going to quickly run through one of the scenarios: bringing down a dictator. The small subtropical nation of Infeliz has been under the grip of dictator Michael Kosanich for nearly 2 decades, and now with his legitimacy waning under increased labor unrest, he is tightening his grip even stronger, having full support of the army and direct control of a personal paramilitary force to keep citizens in line while he exploits the nation's rich nickel deposits and llama wool industry. The movement in this scenario is the creatively titled Stop the Oppression, an alliance of groups such as a coalition of mothers, a student association, and at least one newspaper sympathetic to the cause. The goal is to call for elections, involve the country's indigenous groups in the process, maybe get some international monitors to oversee that the elections are fair, and oust Kosanich while avoiding the chaos and potential bloodshed of a military coup. Just another January and unhappy Infeliz. Through strategic undermining of the opposition and doing a lot of clicking, so much clicking, oh my god, the never-ending clicking, I managed to hold meetings, train my operatives, raise funds, raise more funds, fail to raise funds, Strategically recruit targets and then lose them again when the regime became more attractive for a bit. Recruit industry groups. Make a website. Hand out petitions. Schmooze with the high-ranking police officials. Refine my message by clicking on the Refine Message button. Charm at least one faction of the military. Allow space for the indigenous llama wool producers in the Alliance. Use one of my Alliance members who I wouldn't miss if he went to jail to organize less than legal actions. Strengthen my communication security repeatedly. Tell the Vault 13 Overseer to just go out into the streets wearing our logo because he's literally no good at anything else. And slowly, more parts of the map went from being colored red to being colored green, which I can only assume is a good thing. All the while I tabbed over to the chart at the end of the PDF manual, constantly trying to find tactics that wouldn't result in failure. By June, I somehow successfully pressured the regime into planning an election at the end of the year. I organized a huge rally in the middle of the capital city, which, didn't end well. I organized a huge protest march in the middle of the capital city, which, didn't end well. I organized a huge vigil for our fallen brethren in the middle of the capital city, which didn't end well. Beth Freiberg just cannot manage crises effectively, and I should really have picked up on this a little sooner. This scenario lasts only a year, and I have to tell you that by October, I was feeling pretty despondent. 2 of my best coordinators were in jail, and several others were wasting resources constantly evading arrest. I have printed more t-shirts than a single protest movement ever should have to. At least one skilled member of my alliance left and rejoined the regime, and a poll of one of the districts tells me my chance of winning the election is 0%. Although to be fair, the game also tells me that this poll cannot be trusted because the guy who ran it, one of my guys, had no idea what he was doing. But also, I had no idea what I was doing. I had no idea if my actions were working towards my goals, and I had no idea how I was supposed to trigger those goals anyway. But I must have been doing something right, because in November, the dictator claims were a proper threat. That means we got under his skin. Dangerous, but also an opportunity, I guess? Look, I'm trying to tie this all into a cohesive narrative of some sort for your entertainment, but it's not easy. The mine workers joined my alliance, again a powerful blow against El Presidente. I organized a huge concert in the middle of the capital city, which went great! As a result, the regime labels members of the movement terrorists. When the regime calls you terrorists, that's how you know they have very little support left and can only act with brute force. If you can survive, you will win. Probably. No guarantee, but it is a weak regime that has to resort to making its enemies look more powerful than they really are. Then elections in 1 week! The game really sprung it on me, and I just do not have a clue as to what I need to do to win them. I just semi-randomly used tactics that I thought would make some invisible numbers in the game's back end go up. And I won? Okay, yay! For my efforts, I am rewarded with an evaluation whiteboard. Look, I'm not a member of a non-violent resistance movement in need of training as far as you know, so I didn't really go hog on the planning while playing A Force More Powerful. I'm not a map game or grand strategy player. My experience with these kinds of games amounts to playing a bit of DEF CON until the world blowed up, and a little bit of Civilization 4 just so I could listen to Baba Yetu on loop. I often feel like I could really enjoy a slow-paced game, would really like to sink my teeth into a big JRPG, or build a monstrous machine in a Factorio, or build an equally monstrous dynasty in a Crusader Kings. But every time I try, I just rediscover that I do not have the attention span for it. That's a me problem, and it limits how deep I can get into A Force More Powerful. The game just takes a long time to play. Me ADHD rushing through will take 3 to 4 hours to make half a year of in-game time pass, and some of these campaigns have 3-year timelines and much larger alliances. Now imagine how long it would take to play through all 10 scenarios if you take your time and actually think about what you do, let alone replaying them with different strategies. There is a lot more depth to A Force More Powerful than I experienced in the couple dozen hours I put into it. I hardly touched strikes, roadblocks, and proper economic disruption. I still don't understand how phases and objectives are supposed to work. There's all these places in the strategic estimates, basically the planning phase of the game, where you can write notes and choose preferred policies, and I cannot for the life of me tell you what for. Prioritizing victory conditions does something mechanically, I guess, but don't ask me what. There is so much data to drill down into to make measured decisions, but I'm convinced you need an actual spreadsheet to properly keep track of it all. If you invest the time, this is one of those games you can put hundreds of hours into exploring. There are definitely intricate, interwoven systems here, really well thought out stuff. And boy, is there a lot of reading in this game. Every scenario starts with whole paragraphs of text setting up the background. There are lists within embedded lists within embedded lists of characters and factions, each with itself a long list of attributes that may or may not at all be relevant depending on the scenario. Certain elements of a character's background only matter if ethnic conflict plays a role, for example. There's victory conditions, there's policy preferences, there's tactic descriptions, news updates, and of course the manual and Resistopedia, which you'll be consulting every few minutes. As much as this is just not my kind of game, I still feel like it could be improved in a couple of aspects. The underlying rule set seems to be a rich framework to tell some fascinating stories, but I think the front end, in spite of the cool and consistent notebook aesthetic, leaves much to be desired in terms of communicating what the hell is going on. Especially the connection between the tactics and the victory conditions is just so opaque. Like in the scenario I described before, one of the victory conditions is to bring the indigenous llama wool producers into the movement. That's pretty straightforward. Appeal to them until they join your alliance. There are specific tactics to accomplish this. You know, throw a party, organize a meeting, that kind of stuff, followed by a specific recruit member tactic. But how do you convince the dictator to call for elections? There is no call for election tactic. There is no meter that builds up to it. It just happens for some reason. Same with actually winning the elections. I'm not saying it's random or arbitrary. I do think the game is simulating something. But even though I won the elections, I couldn't tell you what actions led to that result. So how am I supposed to learn which tactics work? There's detailed in-game charts for every single variable, but I don't know what they mean to me in this scenario. I will say, I think it's cool how you can select your victory conditions at the start. You get a little more replay value by playing around with these settings, of course, and they kind of function as a way to modulate the difficulty. But the game lets you play around with this because the goal is not to teach you how to win this game. It's to teach you strategy and planning skills, and to understand that sometimes you'll have to prioritize certain goals over others. The manual specifically states that some scenarios are not 100% winnable. What the game doesn't teach anything about, however, is community building, the human side of resistance. It's all menus and charts and maps and low detail profile pictures and even lower detail crowd sprites. Everything and everyone is just a resource. And while I understand that a certain level of abstraction can create a sense of universality, I feel like this community building aspect doesn't just take a back seat to the systems, but is almost missing entirely. That said, I think the game is somewhat realistic in portraying the desperation of engaging in non-violent conflict. There's this arc where you start a scenario hopeful and ready to kick some ass, non-violently of course, but as time passes you just become hopeless and mired in the complexity of the campaign, the fear of failure and its consequences, and having to deal with the frustratingly unfair tactics of the regime. Perhaps inadvertently, the lesson is not when to deploy strikes or when to communicate your message or whatever. The lesson is that non-violent resistance is thankless, dangerous, and that change cannot happen unless it is seriously organized and intensely persistent. A thing about the game that will only dawn on you by playing it is that it's excessive. 10 complex scenarios, menus upon menus upon menus, and a very intricate and thought out background simulation. Apparently the budget for the game was $3 million, and while you don't see that visually, you do feel it mechanically. And nowhere is that more evident than in the game's scenario editor, or should I say editors. You get 3 of them, and they're complex enough that the whole package gets its own 65-page PDF manual. The city map editor lets you place 3D buildings, parks, and roads on a grid to build the cities of your scenario's nation. I only played around with it a little because it's not quite stable on modern Windows, but I did learn from it that buildings can get vandalized, become dilapidated, or get destroyed entirely. The country map editor lets you load in a bitmap map and draw your nation's borders, regions, roads, and points of interest. And then the main scenario editor ties it all together and gives you access to everything, the entirety of the game's systems. And while there is a user interface to configure the basics, to really customize goals and victory conditions, you'll have to do some Lua scripting. You can see how complex this can get, how deeply you can customize scenarios, and how much effort went into making these tools for this game that is itself a kind of tool. They really put a lot of work and a lot of money into this game. Maybe a suspicious amount of money even? Hi, now a quick word from this video's sponsor, Skullshare. Okay, do you think they're gone? Is it just you and me? So if you made it this far, you must think I'm kinda cool. If you think I'm kinda cool, why not go to patreon.com/alienbob and get all kinds of extra bonus stuff, probably, you know, it's a Patreon. If you can't do Patreon, why not come hang out at the Discord or the forum, both of which are called the underscore, kind of confusingly, but what can you do? It's a chill place to hang out. And lastly, have you liked and or subscribed yet? Leave a comment. All that algorithm shit. It's useful. You do all of that, maybe, I'll think you're cool too. Alright, let's finish this like it still was an ad so that the people coming back after they did the tap 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 think that they missed something that wasn't this important. Was it important? Who cares? So go to skullshare.com/alienbob for 20% off your first skull. Thank you, Skullshare. Now back to the video. So that's A Force More Powerful, the game of non-violent strategy. In spite of it not being my kind of game, I think it's pretty straightforward. It's a strategy game using real non-violent tactics, and it works as designed. But like Remission, this is a game with two very distinct audiences. Yes, just as with the documentary and book that inspired it, it's an educational piece meant for a wider audience to teach them about the nature of non-violent conflict in general. But its other intended audience is a bit more specific. The game's manual and promotional material specifically mentioned that non-violent movements were using the documentary and book for training, looking at these compilations of success stories as examples on what to do and what not to do. But they weren't designed as training material. The game, very explicitly, is. The manual is very serious about this, adding the caveat that real life is in no way guaranteed to work out the same as these simulations. So, A Force More Powerful isn't just a tool, it's a weapon. This game is an op. The makers of A Force More Powerful, no matter what their stated intentions, are not neutral parties. Just look at who you are playing as. You're a faceless, nameless agent. A strategist. Someone with no direct skin in the game. Someone who, unlike the movement leaders, is not at any risk. This is not entirely unique in strategy games, even if many of them have you playing as the leader of a major faction, the mayor of the city, the head of a dynasty. You may think this is too close of a reading, but what if the strategist in A Force More Powerful is not so faceless and nameless as we think on the surface? What if there's a deeper conspiracy? I mean, a film and series, a book, a big budget video game partly meant to be given away for free. There really is a lot of money being spent here. Whose? And why? Remember why Peter Ackerman broke away from the Albert Einstein Institution and founded the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict? He wanted to turn theory into action. Ackerman names his son Elliot in the dedication to the A Force More Powerful book. Elliot Ackerman is a former US Marine who has done work for the Central Intelligence Agency, an organization rather infamous for shoving its hands where it don't belong. Both Peter and Elliot have been members of the Council on Foreign Relations, a Washington, D.C.-based think tank whose influence on American government policies across the 20th century could easily fill several documentaries of their own, and whose membership counts many connections to the CIA and other tentacles of the US intelligence apparatus. The ICNC's co-founder, Jack Duvall, alongside being a TV producer, was an officer in the US Air Force and had embedded himself deeply into political comings and goings in Washington. And the game's advisor, Ivan Merovic, of Serbian nonviolent movement Otpor? After the ousting of Milosevic, there were some uncomfortable revelations about Otpor's funding sources, which include sizable contributions directly from the American government through its many international aid arms. Now, don't let Pepe Sylvia fool you. This isn't meant to be taken super seriously. It's more to illustrate proximity and influence. This video game that I hold in my hand is a product that's just a few degrees of separation away from the CIA. Does that mean the CIA is responsible for it? That the CIA funded or made it? No, of course not. I can't prove any of that. And they're more into making FMV adventure games, or board games. But there does not have to be an organized conspiracy, a shadowy cabal, the Illuminati, some other anti-Semitic trope. The people who wanted a force more powerful to be made ran in similar circles, shared similar political ideologies, and had similar goals. The ICNC likes to profile itself as neutral and global. The word international is right there in the name. But regardless of what you think about its objectives and actions, it is a thoroughly American organization which produced a thoroughly American game in order to uphold American interests on behalf of the American government. The same government responsible for COINTELPRO. The same government responsible for Operation Gladio. The same government responsible for deposing democratically elected leaders the world over, quite often through non-violent means, quite often by funding, mobilizing, supporting, and training local movements. So the true purpose of a force more powerful is to be a tool or a weapon. And who really is holding the weapon here? Let me just read to you this small section of this article from Military Review, official journal of the United States Army Combined Arms Command from the year 2020. Covertly sponsoring a non-violent campaign may allow an external sponsor to influence the operational environment to achieve strategic ends while maintaining plausible deniability. This lowers domestic political risk as well as the risk of intervention by adversaries of the external sponsor who may be allied with the targeted regime. This likely keeps the conflict below the threshold of war and in the so-called gray zone between peace and war. Additionally, should the non-violent movement shift to violence or change direction in its strategic objectives, non-attribution allows the external sponsor to withdraw support without negative domestic and international consequences. So, you know, if a pallet of a force more powerful CD somehow ended up in a warehouse in Venezuela, who's to say how that possibly could have happened? The US Army in particular is of course no stranger to using video games to achieve its strategic objectives. The America's Army games were the poster children for serious games that functioned as blatant propaganda for years. But don't let that distract you into thinking they don't have their grubby little mitts in more games. The Call of Duty games are a massive financial and cultural success for reasons I'll never understand, but they also are humongous propaganda operations and receive funding from the American military-industrial complex in exchange for access and authenticity. All they have to do is make American soldiers look like heroes instead of undefeated world champion of war crimes 80 years running. And A Force More Powerful got a sequel. Kind of. See, the game had these 3D elements and was a little resource hungry, was large in size, so had to be printed on a disc, and I assume, though I have no evidence of it, just wasn't the success that the ICNC and Jörg Zimmermann wanted it to be. So in 2010 they released People Power, the game of civil resistance. This time the game was purely a digital download, based on the Adobe Air platform, sold for $10 on the website or available for free if you asked nicely. Breakaway had no involvement in this one. Instead, it was developed by a company called Art and Logic, for which I have found very little info, and none of the names in the credits jump out at me, except of course there's Ivan Marovic again. Although it has a much more simplified and I would say rudimentary aesthetic, People Power is in essence the same game as A Force More Powerful. There's no more city view and there's even more text, much of it in Comic Sans, but the user interface is a bit more confusing. But again, the goal is to use tactics to undermine the regime in one of the 4 built-in scenarios. The planning phase is gone, so in some ways you can jump into the action quicker, and there are HTML help files in the game's folder which I assume were supposed to load in-game, but didn't for me. What can you do? Start a riot? People Power also has a scenario editor, this time very conveniently all built into a single app with no Lua knowledge required. But just like the game itself, it just feels like an interface for a spreadsheet. People Power was supported with patches and content updates all the way up to 2015, though since it's a very similar game and I'm more curious about the surrounding history, I didn't play very much of it. It should be noted that, from what I can tell, both A Force More Powerful and People Power were only released in English. This means the target audience has to have a certain level of education, a certain familiarity with the culture that these games arise out of. and it brings into question its stated purpose if it's not accessible to the average movement member in Eastern Europe or the Middle East or South America. The game takes the descriptive language of Gene Sharp's work, which already by the mere act of categorization created a boundary between what does and does not count as nonviolent action, and turns it into a prescriptive toolset, using its systems to loudly declare what is the correct and proper form of resistance. In this way, the game says a lot about what kind of person with what kind of education and of what kind of class the ICNC considers worthy of being a strategist for these causes. Although it all makes perfect sense if you just assume the strategist is supposed to be a CIA agent.
Welcome again. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but if you're seeing this, there must be a more than adequate reason for my absence. In fact, I hope you'll be able to determine just what that is.
Even if you disregard all the red threads. Forget about all these somewhat sinister connections. Let go of the purpose of think tanks being to launder the influence of a handful of very rich individuals directly into legislation, and look at the entire A Force More Powerful project just on its face. There still pervades throughout all the media, the film, the book, the game, this smell of neutrality, of centrism, of not looking at the structural causes of oppressive regimes or the role that the West and the US in particular has played in enabling them, fostering them, defending them, and of course funding their opposition when they've outlived their usefulness. The film is well produced. The book is well written. And the game is far from shovelware. But it's all a little too feel-good. It's about celebrating half victories over solving the underlying problem. The evil has been defeated. Now we can join the global order of liberal democracy and everyone will be free forever. I don't buy it. We've got more than a century of evidence showing how often pro-democracy movements end up just being pro-US, pro-business, pro-white supremacy. This feel-good tone just makes it more sinister to me. At some point in or after 2025, the ICNC renamed itself to the CNCR, the Center for Nonviolent Conflict Research. I have not been able to find out why. Peter Ackerman passed away in 2022 at the age of 75. Ivan Marovic, advisor for both games, is now the center's executive director. I do wonder if A Force More Powerful the game succeeded in its purpose. I suppose that depends on what you think its purpose is, but is there even a single anecdote out there of someone using it or people power to actually learn something? To take these lessons about civil resistance and apply them to a movement they are a part of, or distributing it amongst members so they can brush up on tactics? Would they still be useful today for current nonviolent resistance movements? Can you conceivably create a scenario with the game's tools about stopping data centers or preventing weapons sales to Israel or fighting for trans liberation? Is a game really the best way to train people on these topics? I think games can be great at teaching people certain things. Not to bring it up again, but Remission at least has actual research papers to prove its effectiveness in its stated purpose. But I have my doubts as to whether A Force More Powerful and People Power are better ways to instruct people on nonviolent tactics than reading a book or a well-crafted pamphlet. Or better yet, joining groups who are involved in such movements. There are people out there right now with direct experience of whatever is currently going on wherever you live, strategizing in an attic or back room on a paper notebook that cannot be scanned by Palantir. Whether it's figuring out how to serve their local community and feed the hungry, or campaigning against a politician that's obviously in the pocket of corporate interests, or straight up trying to save the world from war and industrial exploitation, they'll teach you far more than a $3 million propaganda game ever could. The game is very dry. The narrative hook's very shallow. All of it is fictional locations and fictional people, and it's hard to get yourself to care for any of it. Yeah, okay, I guess I want this oppressed ethnic minority to have more rights, and this journalist should be released from jail, and this president really should not have his own personal death squad. But in the end, you know what I'm doing in the game? I'm clicking buttons. All I feel is that I'm clicking buttons. I'm waiting for outcomes which might as well be random. I do not really have the experience at any point that I'm using tactics and strategy, and that using those well and untangling the political situation and the relations and the needs of the various factions will lead me on the path to victory against the oppressor. Again, as far as you know, I'm not a member of a non-violent resistance movement, and the A Force More Powerful project tries to convince you of this idea that the resistance is necessary out there, in poor, often brown countries, or even when it's closer to home, in the past. But right now, right here, I'm living in the middle of the democratic liberal Western order, and though I'm not an expert in any of this kind of analysis, it's not looking very good, is it? Fascism isn't just on the rise, it's here. It's got a solid footing, and it is well funded. The year is 2026, and we are in the cyberpunk dystopia. I'm talking to you through a network that uses high bandwidth radio waves, fiber optics, and satellites in space to move huge amounts of data across the globe effortlessly. I have access to production equipment that is of much higher quality at a much lower cost than a TV studio would have had just a couple of decades ago. You are watching this on a device that is hundreds, if not thousands of times more powerful than the creaky circuits that delivered men to the moon. And yet, right now, right here, people are being put into camps in abysmal conditions just for what they look like or where they come from, as blatant racism, nationalism, anti-immigration, and queerphobia are whipped up into a frenzy by politicians and corporate media. Globally, access to the internet is being restricted bit by bit while also being increasingly monitored, with forced identity verification being funneled through private corporations, all while the games you play are being used to make military drones more efficient at bombing hospitals and schools and weddings. Peaceful protesters for climate action or against genocide are being labeled as terrorists, and while violence by certain parties is allowed and even encouraged, non-violence is being declared a national security threat whenever convenient. Although if you ask J. Edgar Hoover, that's not a very new phenomenon, is it? Generative AI is eroding the quality of our software, eroding job security, eroding the very concept of truth, intelligence, and critical thinking, and is being deployed as a tool for the techno-feudalists to deprive you of your ownership of hardware and software while they take ownership of the surveillance state to extract what little wealth and freedom us peons still have access to. I wrote the bulk of this script during an unprecedented record-breaking heatwave that has killed thousands of people and that I know a decade from now will be considered quaint, and which was paid for directly by decades of fossil fuel dark money. Everyone knows as a cold hard fact, not a conspiracy theory, a fact backed up by mountains of public evidence, that the most powerful people in the world right now are billionaire child molesters so detached from reality that they think they're above the laws of physics, and we are no longer able to distinguish between their malevolence and their incompetence. They are straight up evil motherfuckers, and we are supposed to just accept this without any resistance because apparently it's good for the stock market. You can watch A Force More Powerful, the movie, for free on the official ICNC YouTube channel, which has not been renamed yet. Unlike the games, they've got it uploaded in every conceivable language because they want this form of their message spread far and wide to as many potential dirty commies as possible before they're infected. Go ahead and give it a look. You might still learn something. I think the book is out of print, but if I was able to get my hands on a copy here in Europe, I think you can find it too if you're up for a big read. It's not just a rehash of the film, for whatever that's worth, and some of these stories are legitimately inspiring, even if I'm somewhat suspicious of what I'm supposed to be inspired for. The games are abandonware, so while their official sites and download links are no longer up, you can find both of them if you know where to look. A Force More Powerful has a physical release and does run on modern Windows so long as you install the Wine D3D wrapper. It's just 2 DLL files. You can also place them in the City Editor folder to get that to work, although again, it's prone to crashing. People Power runs on Adobe Air, which technically went extinct along with Flash, but you can still find it online, even though the ownership situation is very confusing to me. But in any case, you can get it running on Windows, macOS, and Linux because of it. Breakaway is apparently still at it, having since made games and simulations to assist in healthcare practitioner certifications and trained financial fraud detection skills, as well as strategic simulation tools for US Customs and Border Protection, and various tools for the US military and defense industry. I suppose having no scruples about the kind of organizations you associate with can be very profitable, to say it as kindly as I possibly can. Very coincidentally, only a year ago, they uploaded some clips of a force more powerful onto their YouTube channel, along with a short documentary, which was kind of useful for me, and very curiously, a clip of Vox Populi, which just seems to be the same game as a force more powerful with the branding removed. I can't find much more about it, other than apparently in 2009 it was presented at the NATO Modeling and Simulation Group workshop on exploiting commercial games and technology for military use. I feel like I could keep digging and make this into a 4-hour video, but then also I'd find myself somehow dead and stuffed into a duffel bag that only locks from the outside, with everyone declaring it self-inflicted, so I'll just leave it here. Fascists have this trick. It's called overwhelming you with lies. The goal is to make you believe they're more powerful than they really are. But there is no hope, no escape. That them being in power is inevitable, the natural state of things. Just look at the sheer scale and volume of the injustices you are exposed to daily. Fascism, imperialism, global capitalism, forces that serve to enrich a few at the cost of our humanity. Infinite growth! The cultural version of cancer. But it is my firm belief that this rise we're seeing right now is because the people behind it are panicking. They know their age is ending. They see that the future is more social, more communal, more diverse. They are tearing down the global order, the same global order they built to enrich themselves because they knew it was already collapsing. What we are experiencing is the T-1000 taking a bath in a vat of molten metal, screaming, thrashing about, because he knows it's over. Your job is to hang around long enough to avoid all the molten metal splatter. And if you can, to shield others. And then together, build a better world. How do you stop fascism? That's not what this video is about, or a question I would ever be capable of properly answering. I just see a weird old obscure video game and do several hundred hours of research. That's my job. But if there's anything I'm taking away from a force more powerful and from my observation of reality, it's that necessary change cannot happen without capital O organizing. Did you notice that the vast majority of cases highlighted in the documentary are labor movements? It's not a correlation you'd see the ICNC directly pointing out. It makes you think, doesn't it, of what really is the more powerful force. More so than most games, this game is political. Because of its topic, because of its design, because of its provenance, but also by its very existence. It is a tool of power, a weapon, of dubious efficacy, maybe, but still potentially dangerous if wielded by the right hands. But in spite of my skepticism of the motivations behind the A Force More Powerful project and the people involved in its creation, I understand the need for non-violent action and why purposefully violent resistance is almost certainly likely to only cause more violence. In general. Generally. Overall, in the grand scheme of things, non-violence is the way to go. But in a world in which these supposedly allowed and proper forms of protest are being increasingly outlawed anyway, my mind does sometimes drift towards a famous game series that presents an alternate way to combat fascism.